Hey everyone, today I have Tara Holmes with me, and I think she is an expert on the topic that we're going to be talking about today, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, the reason why I find her an expert is she's dedicated 13 years active duty Air Force, so she is a major, to women's mentorship and DEI. And she's launched multiple DEI related programs. She's been a longtime WIT, so Women's Initiative team member. And right now, she is currently getting her PhD, and she is in her dissertation year of earning her PhD in organizational behavior, human resource management at the University of Maryland in DEI. She's currently served on the UMD Senate Committee for DEI, and she's planned several conferences. Like, this woman is an expert in the topic, so I am extremely, she laughs, but I'm like amazed by all the things she's done. And on top of that, she's married with two young kids, ages 4 and 2. So Wonder Woman over here. So
My
hey,
goodness.
welcome. So we're gonna start off with what is DEI?
Sure. Well, first, let me say hey back to you, and thank you so much for all the kind words. I'm thrilled to be here talking about this very important topic. It's a topic that's a bit contested right now politically. So I really appreciate you giving me this opportunity to share what I know and kind of where my research interests are. So thank you. Okay, so what is DEI? So diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's the acronym, right? But it's important to recognize that different organizations use different acronyms, right? In the Air Force, actually, I think we're using, we, not I think, we do use DEIA now, which includes accessibility on the end.
Mm.
But other organizations might include B for belonging or J for justice. So we're going to talk about DEI, but just kind of realize that like it kind of can include these related constructs of like belongingness, justice, accessibility. So the way that I kind of think about DEI is kind of in two main ways. So the first way is it's can be considered what's called a bundle of human resource practices. So, for example, policies, training, recruiting strategies, hiring practices, etc., that kind of work together with the goal of enhancing diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, belonging, justice. Um, the other way you could think about it is it's kind of colloquially, I always mess that word up, used as to describe like an ideal or like a feeling um, that exists within the culture and climate of an organization. So it's like the feeling where diversity is recognized and celebrated, people are treated fairly, barriers to success are identified and dismantled. And so people not only feel that they're included, but they also feel like they belong. So we often hear this referred to as like a climate for inclusion or a diversity climate. So those are kind of the two main ways I think about it. But it's really what we call like a multi-level construct, meaning that it manifests at different levels of an organization. And it does so in meaningful ways. So at the organizational level, that's where you find things like DEI related policy and like formalized roles like chief diversity officers. This is where a lot of initiatives can live. And of course, climate is is kind of a top level thing, right? Because it's the climate of the whole organization. Below that, you might have like a group or team level. We think of this as like, I don't know, whatever's below the organizational level. It could be a base, it could be your unit, it could be your like immediate work team that you work on. And here we look at like shared perceptions and group norms and how that uh, is influenced by DEI or influences DEI. But initiatives in climate can also live at this level too, right? And then at the individual level, we're really looking at like our individual perceptions and feelings and attitudes and our individual behavior, right? That's often a result of what's happening at those higher levels. So that's really kind of how I conceptualize DEI as both like this very practical, like actual program or thing But also it's kind of like this feeling or like
Yeah.
these attitudes and perceptions. Yeah.
So, how would you like how does diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of relate to each other?
It's a really good question. Um, I think first we'll kind of define what they are and then talk a little bit about how they relate. There's a lot of definitions out there, a lot of like formal definitions, but I'll just give you the ones that I think are pretty close or pretty commonly accepted. Um, so diversity generally refers to like heterogeneity or just really differences among individuals on some particular trait, right? We're really used to talking about diversity as it relates to like demographic
Mm.
diversity, right? This is what's known as like surface level diversity, like the um, characteristics that you can kind of see and measure almost immediately without a lot of digging.
Mm-hmm.
So, sex, gender, race, age, these types of things. There's also like deep level diversity, which is the differences in lived experience. It's our different skill sets, our different abilities. It can be education, it can be neurodiversity. Um, so it really can mean a lot of things. And I think sometimes we like hamstring ourselves into like the demographic piece and not consider like the very broad and unique ways that we're different from one another. Okay, so equity, not to be confused with equality, but equity is the fair treatment for all people. It doesn't mean treating everyone the same. It means like it's taking into account diversity, like taking into account our differences and adjusting treatment so that the end result is the same. So it's recognizing that not everybody starts out in the same place or needs the same things to be successful. And then there's inclusion, which is a bit trickier. So you could think of it as a verb, like an action that you could do. So, like, I invited Brittinie to the meeting, therefore I included her, right? But in terms of DEI, inclusion is kind of really in the eye of the beholder. It's the perspective of the person. Does Brittinie feel like an esteemed member of this workplace through the way that she's treated, right? Just because
Mm-hmm.
I invite you to the meeting doesn't mean that you feel that you're welcome there or that you're going to be heard in the meeting, right? So I think that gets a little bit tricky for people sometimes. Like, yeah, we include everybody. Yeah, but do they feel that? Do they feel that
Mm-hmm.
way? So those are kind of the three main constructs. As for how they relate to each other, uh, diversity is kind of a double-edged sword, right? We like to focus on the positive outcomes of what diversity brings to an organization. Often, um, there the research shows that diversity leads to a lot of positive effects, like creativity and problem solving and performance. But we take for granted that it ensures better performance. Like just because you have diversity doesn't mean that higher performance follows.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's because diversity also is shown to be responsible for like increased tension and conflict. When people are different, they don't always understand each other, or they
Mm-hmm.
solve problems different ways. Different things are important to them. Um, so when we're all the same and think the same, like it's a lot easier for us to get along and just move out smartly to do the thing that we're trained to do. So I think that how diversity, once diversity like emerges, once it's a state, like it's there, especially in spaces that were historically set up for only specific types of people to succeed, the system and the processes may not support the success of the diversity of members that are there, right? And that's where equity becomes super important. The pursuit of equity helps to integrate diversity into a system like a workplace. It's recognizing the differences that, that exist and kind of asking that question of like how can we make it possible for each type of person to succeed given where they're coming from or how they see the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or how they experience the world. And finally, when diversity exists and like practices are equitable, there's a higher likelihood of inclusion on each other to a place of inclusion. Diversity on its own doesn't guarantee inclusion. Inclusion is kind of like this higher order goal, or at least it should be, in my perspective. That, you know, not only do you have a seat at the table, but you also feel supported and encouraged to be yourself there and to feel like your voice is going to be heard. So when you feel like you have this system that's set up for you to succeed and those you work with are value you and your effort, I think that's how like diversity, equity, and inclusion really come together in that way. Hopefully that kind of like
Yeah,
answers. Okay.
I think honestly, like I'm really glad you kind of dived into like the differences and the definition because I mean, I hate to say that I guess I'm naive, right? Like when I think of DEI, I think of like you said, just the physical things that we see. So not thinking or like taking in consideration like the education levels. That one was just kind of eye opening for me. I'm like, oh shit. Yeah, I'm just gonna cuss on it. This is gonna be a
That's okay.
toxic one.
Explicit episode here.
Yeah, yeah. Here we go. I'm like, oh shit. Like that is something that you're right, like, and I didn't think about that. And then especially with inclusion, I probably would have been also like, well, I included them and didn't think of it on the other end, like, oh, do they feel included just because I invited
Yeah.
them? So I think that is so important, and this is why like I love that we're doing this podcast, because bringing in the
Me
different
too.
perspectives like opens up people's perceptions. And if we could change or at least understand how other people see or view things, we could progress better and make everything better, and to include DEI. So, with that
Yeah.
being said, why is DEI important in the workplace, like generally, and like how does it contribute to the overall military readiness and effectiveness specifically?
Sure. So I think DEI serves several really important purposes in the workplace, and like these are in no particular order, just kind of piecemeal. From like a human resources perspective, DEI in the sense of like organizational practices, like we talked about at the beginning, and policies are it's important because it allows organizations to not only ensure that they are following like relevant laws that exist, but also to establish like a common operating picture at all levels of an organization. So that's especially important for large organizations like the military, you know, so like um, you know, how we feel about diversity, how supervisors are supposed to engage with subordinates and vice versa, how, you know, and how people are supposed to interact and how the work gets done. Um, DEI is really an important part of that, you know, like how we hire people, how we promote people, those types
Mhm.
of things. Um, from like a legitimacy perspective, like organizations seek legitimacy like from broader society. It's hard to exist in society as an organization if everybody's like, man, they're out to lunch, like they're harming people, they're, you know, like basically their moral values are kind of in the gutter or whatever. Like
Mm.
it's hard to persist as an organization that's not seen as legitimate. um DEI kind of acts as a signal in this perspective, right? It's a signal to employees. The organization is serious about them, right? And their work experience. It's also a signal to that broader society that the organization is like morally aligned with the principles of social justice. Um, and I think where organizations can get in a little bit of trouble with signaling is when the signals are not perceived by either employees or society as being like genuine. Like when organizations are perceived as like virtue signaling, um, where they're not really like walking the talk. They're just like,
Mm.
yeah, you know, DEI is important, and then like their practices are all, you know, don't substantiate that.
Mhm.
Um, and then finally, I think from a talent management perspective, having a robust DEI program and climate is part of that is like probing for areas of improvement, right? So when you are an organization that has resources dedicated to DEI, it ensures that the organization is paying attention to the
Mm-hmm.
employees, right? It's looking for barriers that exist for employees and addressing those barriers, and doing so has like these positive downstream consequences of like improving the culture and employee job satisfaction and organizational commitment. um, so in some, like, people want to work for organizations and will keep
Mm-hmm.
working in an organization where they feel valued, cared for, and understood. And I think that's from those three different perspectives, that's why DEI is really important for organizations generally. As it pertains to the military, I'm going to offer two kind of competing perspectives because I think we have to be honest about the narratives that exist out there. So
Mm-hmm.
there's one perspective that says DEI is critical to our readiness and effectiveness. Um, we're still an all volunteer force. So the military is in direct competition with other organizations and industries for talent. What's more, it expects so much more from its members and than a lot of other civilian organizations, right? I mean, we put our life on the line. We're willing to sacrifice to that level to work here, which makes this a really unique organization. Um, so for last year, fiscal year 20, the only branches that met the recruiting goals were the Marine Corps and the Space Force, which are the smallest branches of all of them. In some instances, they only met their recruiting goals by one person. So like barely squeaked it out, right?
Oh my goodness.
Um, and even though there's like a lot of reasons that can contribute to like recruiting challenges, which include like the pool of eligible candidates getting
Mm-hmm.
smaller and smaller because of things like being overweight or a history of drug use, etc. There's also like changing dynamics in public support and confidence in the military. So all of that is happening, but we can't deny that DEI is a part of this.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think there's an article that came out in Defense recently that said about 41% of the military identifies as a member of a minority group.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that number is expected to increase. So that's almost half of our members.
Right.
Right. So if we want to continue recruiting diverse talent, we have to ensure that we have a DEI infrastructure that supports and keeps that talent. We need people to want to keep working here, and people won't stay if they feel like they don't matter, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
like they can't succeed. If they feel like they can't succeed, they're not going to want to be here, and that's directly related to our ability to be ready and effective. We need people, right? Additionally, DEI initiatives have highlighted in a very objective manner, like with data, that there's some very real disparities in the experiences of different demographic groups that are serving in the military, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's allowed for the identification of barriers to service for members that belong to these groups, which allows for them to be addressed. So if we didn't have a focus on DEI, it's possible that it would take even longer or never happen,
Mm-hmm.
for us to uncover some of the things that, have come to light recently, whether it's challenges for women or the racial disparity reports, that have come out recently. So in that way, I think that it's critical to our effectiveness and readiness. There's also like, from a climate and culture standpoint, it's a mission and force enabler. DEI directly supports trust building and a culture of respect and empathy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about having more cohesive teams, teams that can rely on and trust each other to go out and do the mission. Part of DEI is also education and awareness of social group dynamics, the influence of power, which we can't deny is a part of our organization, right? We have this
Mm-hmm.
hierarchy, and how that power influence, manifests in relationships. And then it's also education and awareness about our own psychology, right? Like biases and stereotyping, and the recognition that that's all normal. That's how we're built. But how we deal with that can affect the types of relationships we have, um, which goes back to trust and team building and all of these things, right? So we start understanding, when we have an awareness and education about that, we start understanding other people more, and we seek to understand people more, and we get better at articulating our own perspectives and acknowledging that our own perspective is not the only perspective. So that all of this allows us to deal with conflict better in the workplace. And overall, I think it just makes teams more cohesive. So that's the DEI's critical perspective, like critical to our success. There's another perspective that, and this is what we've seen come out like really, in politics recently, especially right now, is that DEI does not contribute to readiness, and it's actually detracts from it, which I think is a really interesting perspective.
Yeah.
But I'll talk about it just briefly. Like, first, I guess I'll just say it's my opinion that these arguments that are made on this side are often coming from a place of not really understanding everything that DEI brings to the table, not understanding the institutional challenges that are inherent in the military system, and potentially not understanding how this system impacts the experiences of the people who serve. I also think this perspective is a little bit grounded in some zero-sum thinking, where we can't have both, like a robust DEI infrastructure and also be like total badasses and be like a ready and effective force. Like, why? I don't think they need to be mutually exclusive. Like, we could probably have both, right? So some of the main points from this side is that we shouldn't be putting resources towards things that aren't the mission, right? Like, so we shouldn't be funding any, DEI training or people who specialize in this area as resources for the military. But I think that part of the problem with this argument is that it usually comes from a place that people think that the military is prioritizing DEI over the mission. And I think that's a mistake. I don't think that that's accurate. I think just because we allocate resources toward it because we think it's important doesn't mean that we don't first prioritize the mission.
Right.
So that's one, one point. Another point is that DEI undercuts merit. So we always talk about like picking the most qualified person for the job. And I think there's a little bit of flawed logic here as well, where zero-sum thinking happens, because I think that DEI actually strengthens a meritocracy. If your most qualified and best person for the job is not a candidate for the job because there's specific barriers in place that don't allow them to rise to the point of being considered for the job, then you don't really have the most qualified and best person. You have the most qualified and best person of those that were able to be seen, right? So that's another viewpoint. And finally, there's a narrative like that the military is already one of the most diverse institutions in the country, which is not false. Like, that's pretty true. Like, it is highly diverse overall. But it's not, that diversity doesn't transcend all ranks and components of the military, right? So we know this, like the data shows us unequivocally, that in the lowest ranks we're the most diverse, and as you go up the rank structure, it becomes less and less diverse. So that's a matter of, I think, digging more into the data and not just taking the top level, like 40%, 40% belong to minorities, like they're good.
Right.
So yeah, I think that answers it. Why it's important.
So, I mean, you talk a lot about like implementing like these programs and initiatives. So, like, what are some challenges in doing so? Because, like you said, the Air Force is a big organization, and the military as a whole. So, like, what are some challenges in implementing these things that are obviously necessary?
There's a lot. There's a lot of challenges. Okay. one, I think resources are a challenge. Okay. Having the time to dedicate to it, getting the right people to do that kind of work, hiring the right people for that, and often the money itself to invest in doing it right.
Mm.
Whether it's for technology, for training and education, or for hiring those professionals, and our resources are determined kind of outside of our system. So like Congress has to approve stuff like our budget and all these things. So we can't always utilize, we may have resources that we may not be able to utilize at all times. And that's any organization. Second, like at the organizational level, when DEI practices are not aligned to strategy, that's tough because then like across the organization, they aren't always implemented consistently.
Mm.
So we call this in OB, we call it like horizontal and vertical fit, which is that the initiatives kind of aren't really tied to any particular strategy and they're disjointed and they're kind of resulting in these disparate like experiences. Like you're at base X and they're doing this and we're at base Y and they're doing something different. Which isn't always like a horrible thing because you got to like meet people where they are or whatever. But if there's no like overarching strategy, then they're trying to build their own strategy disparately like across the organization. So I think that's a challenge. Another one is kind of circling back with employees on the progress of initiatives. I think organizations get really excited to like launch stuff, but there isn't always like the follow through of like, well, how's it going? Like having these like periodic check-ins, right? And I think one reason for this is that we know that progress in this area in DEI is slow, right? And organizations or leaders of organizations may not want to circle back if there hasn't been significant progress. But I think that's kind of a mistake, honestly, because employees really value honesty and they value being part of the discussion. So even if there's no progress, like coming back and being like, hey, this, what we're doing, we're not really seeing any progress. Like, what ideas do you have? Like, where are we going wrong with this? And just kind of opening that up for discussion. I think employees really value that. And they can be really important resources for helping to identify how things can be done differently. Accountability is also a problem. I think organizations can struggle with accountability when it comes to DEI stuff. Not only do like leaders need to be held accountable, right? That's like often what we think of, but really all employees need to be held accountable. And sometimes there's not a very clear way of doing that. There's like the hard lines like harassment, discrimination, sexual assault, like all that stuff. Those are like pretty hard lines. But the day-to-day, like harder things, like, I don't know, microaggressions, like it's DEI in some ways, some of the things are hard to, for lack of a better term, like kind of prove, and they can cause like, it's like people challenging each other's perspectives. Like, I don't think my leaders do, like one person's toxic leader is another person's favorite leader, right? Like it's kind of a matter of perspective. But I think in terms of policy, it's easier to hold people accountable. But in terms of like kind of the culture climate stuff, it gets a little bit more difficult. And the last one that I can think of that I think is one of the biggest challenges, and this is true of any kind of organizational change, not just is buy-in. Like, not just like attitudinally, like, yeah, I think DEI is like really good, but like behaviorally too. Like, we need people to actually do like the DEI things, not just say that they will. And this is true for like leaders, supervisors, employees. Like everyone has a role to play, and when the buy-in isn't there, we can expect kind of resistance instead. So
I do like how you mentioned, like, if there is no progress, that to like kind of reevaluate that. because to me it's like no progress is still progress, because that's a way to not do it. And I think you're right, and I think you're so spot on, where like we don't want to reevaluate or go back to see how something's working if there is no progress. We just assume, oh, it's not working, let's come up with a new program, and then it starts the whole cycle over again. And then it kind of
Yeah.
goes into the buy-in, right? Like, okay, well, here's another program I have to learn, or here's another program I got to do. And then I feel like that almost causes resistance in people, because they're like, well, they're just trying to check boxes at this point.
Yeah.
So, like, why do people resist DEI at work?
It's my favorite question because this is what I work on the most. And something I really do truly find fascinating. So I'll say from my research, I've kind of come up with a couple like main reasons. The first is that it's threatening to some people. Some people find it threatening. Researchers have found support for numerous different types or flavors of threat, if you will, that employees feel in reaction to DEI. And I just want to say that this feeling of threat can be true for both members that identify with like majority groups and minority groups. So it can be threatening for anybody, not just people who are in the majority. And there's a lot of different types of threat in the research, but I think the three main kinds that are talked about the most are like first is like resource threat. So there's only so many resources, and now there's going to be less for me or my group because we're going to share resources with other different types of groups. Maybe that's jobs, maybe it's promotions, maybe it's many kind of resource. Then there's like the identity or status threat, which is the group I identify with is under attack in some way or is being devalued in some way. And then the third main one type of threat that I see is like it's called symbolic threat, and it's talking about like the values and beliefs that I have or that my group has are at risk. So we talked a little bit earlier about how one of the kind of counter arguments to DEI is that it undercuts like merit or it like this idea of meritocracy, because that's important in our society, right? Like people want to be rewarded based on merit. So anyway, in this way, people can feel like that symbolic threat about their meritocratic beliefs. So it's threatening. Second, they may not feel like they need it. There's a theory called optimal distinctiveness theory, where it basically says like as humans we have two competing needs. One is the need to belong, and the other is the need to be distinct or to stand out. And we all have like this ideal or optimum like ratio of that, like, and yours can be different than mine. Like you might really need to stand out and that really works for you, whereas I really have more on the belonging side. So if you're if in your workplace you feel that your belongingness and distinctiveness needs are being met, you may not feel like DEI is like a necessary thing for you. So you might resist it in that way, like, oh, we're good here, like everybody's we're all good. The third reason I think people resist DEI is it's risky. DEI is risky, both professionally and socially. So there's a study that Heckman and colleagues did in 2017 that found that women and racial and ethnic minorities who engage in diversity valuing behavior were rated lower in competence and on their performance reviews.
That's
So yeah, there's more, like academic research that supports that it can be professionally risky. If I mess it up, maybe, my boss is going to judge me for messing something up. And then there's also like this social risk. Like if I mess it up, my peers are going to judge me. So I think that's another element. And finally, there's something about like the signal or the messaging that doesn't quite sit right. And that's why people resist it. Like something's not coming through in a way that is like digestible or that sits well with people. Um, so this can be about like the quality of messaging, like it's not framed well or it's not communicated well, or sometimes it's misinterpreted by the receiver.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the quality, not only is like the quality important, but something like I'm working on like for my dissertation work is also the quantity of signaling and messaging. So people can start to feel like overexposed if they work, if they work in a place that's like really DEI heavy and there's a lot of messaging and a lot of signals out there. Similar to how we experience like advertising or issues in the news that persist over a long period of time. Like if they're still talking about like remember like during COVID-19 where like it was
Oh
like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
everything was COVID-19, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then people stopped watching the news because they didn't want to hear about it anymore. So
Right.
this is something that like I'm kind of looking at. So even though people genuinely support DEI with their attitudes, there's a possibility that they get turned off by how much messaging they're getting.
Mm-hmm.
So those are kind of the four main things: is threat. Maybe they feel like they don't need it. It's risky, and then finally, like something's going on with the messaging that's not like palatable to them.
What role does like leadership play in like fostering this culture?
Well, I think with as with any type of change or type of culture that you want to achieve, leadership plays an enormous role, like
Mm-hmm.
super critical. Um, they set the tone and their behavior is under the microscope for everyone in that organization. We look to our leaders to set the example and to give us clues about what is valued and rewarded in this organization. Um, I'd go even further and say that it's not just top leadership
Mm-hmm.
that is critically important. It's anyone who supervises people. If you're a supervisor, you like critically important to the success of DEI initiatives, but also of achieving that inclusive culture. The academic research calls this behavioral integrity, right? It's very clear about this. Like supervisors, managers, and leaders, they absolutely have to align their words and their actions. Um, for DEI to be successful, because when they don't, employees pick up on that in a heartbeat. Like they
Mm-hmm.
know it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the words just become empty. So you can talk about how it's important all day, but I don't see you putting any effort or changing anything. So like, why am I going to do that? It's obvious that it's not going to be rewarded.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think not only do they play a role, but they're actually responsible. Like leaders are responsible
Mm-hmm.
for creating an inclusive culture, and they should also be accountable for it.
So we talked a lot about leaders and like supervisors, but like what about people on more like the lower level or people who aren't? So like how can like service members contribute to fostering this diverse and inclusive workplace?
I think so. There's a lot of ways, but a framework that I really like is in the book called "Inclusify: The Power of Uniqueness and Belonging to Build Innovative Teams," and that's written by Dr. Stephanie Johnson. Um, and this framework is called the AEIOU framework. So A stands for amplify, passing the microphone, right? So um, it's ensuring that you get the opinions of people, and that you might have to specifically ask for other people's opinions, especially in an organization like ours where there is this hierarchy, right? And there is this like sense that maybe as the lowest ranking person there, your opinion doesn't matter. So if you have the chance um, to give someone if you have the microphone and you have the chance to give it to someone else, like to do that. E stands for edify. It's learning about inequality and teaching others about your own experience. There's no shortage of like books, podcasts, articles that can help people kind of dive deeper on a lot of these topics that are relevant to DEI. And then, when you have the opportunity, if somebody asks you about your experience, or you have the opportunity to share your experience, like, do it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you have to do it. Um, I stands for identify, which means like engaging in diverse mentoring relationships. 71% of mentoring relationships are between people belonging to the same demographic.
Oh.
So I like to remind people that, like, there's no rule that says that you can only have one mentor, and that they have to be like you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's good. I encourage people to find mentors that are not like them, because they're going to teach you something different. And when you have the opportunity to mentor others, like, mentor people who are not like you.
Mm-hmm.
And then O is optify. It's shining a light on other people's accomplishments. So the number one predictor of feeling like you belong in an organization is being recognized for your accomplishments. And it's actually shown in our organization, like in the military, I think we do okay-ish at this.
Mm-hmm.
And some units are better than others. But in broadly speaking, organizations, broadly speaking, it's actually not very common, which is kind of crappy. But I think what's really cool about this is that you don't need to be the leader to recognize someone. Like, actually, peer recognition has been shown to be even more impactful than being recognized by a leader. And then U is to unify, which is bringing in allies and being an ally. So I think there's 2 McKinsey reports now that show this, that people with underrepresented identities do the bulk of DEI work, and they do it above and beyond their formal responsibilities, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're not getting paid extra. They don't get more time to do it. There's no real reward for doing it. So it's about sharing in being an ally. A lot of it is sharing in the responsibility of making the work experience better for people. So picking up some of that work. So that's her framework, the AEIOU. And I like to add to that a C, which is courage, because it takes an incredible amount of courage to put yourself out there and to, um, especially in some of the environments that we find ourselves in the workplace today, people can be afraid to ask questions. They be afraid to get something wrong, to use the wrong pronoun, etc. And I think what all of us can do, no matter what level of the organization that we're at, is to kind of harness that courage. Like, you have to try, you have to put yourself out there, but also on the flip side of that, we have to have grace and understanding for people when they mess it up, because we're all going to mess it up. Everybody
Right.
messes it up. Like, nobody's going to do it perfectly every time. So having a little bit of, or a lot of, just grace for ourselves and for other people.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that answers the question. That's my favorite framework for, what can any average Joe do? These are the things.
Yeah, I do love that, because the last comment that you said, that we have to have grace for ourselves but also other people, because sometimes I do feel like we're too quick to get offended when
Mm-hmm.
it was honestly a genuine, like, mess up or mistake. And so just like recognizing and giving grace, I think, is so important for us to like move forward, especially on this topic of DEI.
I don't think that means that you can't call people out. But I
Right.
think that there's definitely a respectful way to a kind way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's not accusatory or aggressive, I guess.
What do you have, like, a way for people to like do it in a nice way?
So I don't know that there's one way, technique that handles every situation, right?
Right.
If it's just me and you talking and we're just having a conversation in the office, and I say something that you didn't really feel was cool, I think you can say, well, what did you mean by that? or say more about that, and just kind of like to engage in like a conversation, and hey, maybe I don't really agree with that, or hey, I know you probably didn't mean it, but I don't really like it when you use this term about whoever we're talking about. Um, Things change a lot, I think, when you're in a group setting where there's other people involved, where there's power dynamics involved. But I don't think there's anything wrong with asking, if something happens like in a meeting or something like that. I don't think there's anything wrong with asking to talk to somebody, step aside and talk to someone about something that came up or that happened. I think that's the best way to handle that. I don't think like um, necessarily calling someone out in front of other people is a good way to go.
I agree with that.
Yeah,
Pull them aside.
yeah, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, because I think I would always appreciate that one-on-one chance to like either explain why I said something or just to admit, like say sorry, I did that, and I've seen the great leaders that I've been fortunate to work for. They're very humble about these kind of things. They'll come in at the next meeting and say, hey, last time I said this and I realize now that was screwed up and I shouldn't have said it. And I have a lot of respect for that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think
Yeah,
it gets
no.
a little hairy, like depending on the situation.
Yeah, no, I think that answers it. Because, like, one thing that I definitely noticed, and I know it's harder, like, it's easier for people to talk boldly on social media or on the computer because you're behind a screen.
Yeah.
But, like, it obviously, what social media obviously predicts is, a certain way that probably wouldn't happen in person. And sometimes they're more accusatory or not open minded and don't want to hear the other person's side. So they're very closed off. So I think, like you said, just having that conversation, at least being open. Like, if you don't agree with it, okay, but let's have that conversation,
Yeah.
and have that empathy for each other and that understanding for each other. And I think that's why, like, we could progress more and make more effort if we do that, have these conversations and not be closed minded.
Yeah. I think I don't know if you ever like I'll name drop real quick, but if you've ever done anything with Dr. Jason Womack from the leadership development, well, he was leadership development course. Now he works for the Space Force. But one of my favorite things that he always says is something to the effect, I'm going to get it, I can't quote it like directly, but it's something to the effect of we're like starving for connection, but we fear connecting. And
Mm,
I, and I think it's like so true. And what you were saying about social media really made me think of that because, um, and I think this is especially true, for the people who will be joining, like our Gen Zers and like younger millennial crowd, and like generationally, people who have grown up on technology and with social media. I think this is something that we'll continue to see is like we struggle with that face to face human contact and like having hard conversations, and I think that's why really DI is especially beneficial, especially in the time that we live in right now, because it helps give people communication skills. It helps build emotional intelligence. These are things that people our youngest airmen coming in may or may not have as much experience with as older people who didn't grow up with that technology.
mm-hmm.
So it's really interesting, I think, especially to think of like generational differences, and how
Yeah.
DEI can really help us navigate some workplace conflict.
Yeah, I agree. I never even thought about that, like how, like, communication wise, like, it is probably harder for them to do it in person because, yeah, like,
Mhm.
behind a screen I can talk all the mad shit that I want, but then when it's face to face, it's different.
Yeah.
So yeah, we definitely need to start making sure that we have those communication skills to be able to move forward. And emotional intelligence, I mentioned this in another podcast, but there's this book called Emotional Intelligence 2.0. It's on Audible.
I'll look at
But it has, like, the four, it talks about personal but also interpersonal. So it's not just like, there's four different ones and I can't think of them off the top of my head, but it is like a really, and I always recommend this because in like all my higher education schooling, they always like recommend this book. So clearly it's a good book to read. Another question I have for you is, what DEI resources do we have in our organization, in like the Air Force or just like in the military in general?
That's a good question too. So I think that the first thing I would recommend people go look at is to start with the DoD DEIA strategic plan.
Mm.
Okay. And then the Air Force recently put out an, Air Force DEIA strategic plan. I would look at those things first, because one of the top things I hear people say is that they don't understand where we're going with DEI, like what the goals are or what the strategy is. So I think these are foundational documents that are really important to kind of understand, like where are we hoping to go.
Yeah.
Secondly, I would mention, I think SAFDI's website is really good to check out. It's f/diversity. It has a ton of resources on it, as well as like policy updates and news. I think SAFDI also puts out like a quarterly like, I don't know what you want to call it. I want to say memo, but it's not like a memo. It's a couple pages long that kind of gives like update. Office for DEI is also really good, and it can be really useful. It has policies and plans, as well as like reports. So like the Air Force doesn't just like do DEI stuff in a vacuum, right? Like we have to follow like the higher DoD level,
Right.
guidance. So I think both of those are really good places to start. And then a couple other things I'll just mention quickly is I'll put in a plug for SAFDI actually created this workforce analytics dashboard, which is super cool. Anyone can use it if you have a CAC. You can, so what it allows you to do is look at demographic data for the whole Air Force, basically, but you can filter it by things that you might be interested in, like your career field, your rank, your base, and things like that. So I think that's really cool. And then I'll also put a plug in for the barrier analysis working groups. So we call them DAFBOGs. So this is like where the magic is really happening when it comes to DEI and like changing policy. So if you're a member of the Air Force, you've probably heard of the Women's Initiative Team, which you mentioned right in the beginning, right? Because I do work with them. But there's 6 other DAFBOGs. There's like the HEAT, the LIT, there's BEST. And they work on policy that affects different, different social groups. So I think if you want to get involved, those are, and they're all voluntary. Like you can just join up and pick something to work on and get going. And they always need volunteers. So I did find like a neat 1-page flyer that talks about each of them, and I can send that to you. It's just like kind of talks about what each one's mission and vision is, and like kind of what they work on, and then how to get a hold of them.
Oh yeah, that's
but
great.
a lot of them have Facebook groups too. So I know the WIT has a really big one. The LIT has one. The HEAT has one. So I think those are a couple of resources that we have. And then there are some podcasts. There's all kinds of things out there. So you just go do some Googling. Like you'll find stuff. There's no shortage.
Well, that's good. Yeah, definitely send me all of that stuff so then I get added into here.
Yeah.
And all your research, because I know you're academia. So I know people who, like me, like to further read into research. I like research-based things instead of just going based off of hearsay. Yeah.
Hopefully won't be too long. So, yeah.
I just have a couple more questions. If you have time.
I have time.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Because one thing that, we were talking about earlier that came to mind is how can unconscious biases be addressed? So I know we were talking about like just communication, right? And stepping someone aside. But is that how you would address like unconscious bias in the workplace as well?
I think unconscious bias is kind of tricky, and it's a tricky terminology too, because it inherently means that you don't know about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think step one is figuring out what biases are yours, like which ones do you have?
Mm-hmm.
And that's like all of our personal responsibility to do. There's some good tools to do that, like the implicit association test is one of those tools that we can use. Um, but it's really like incumbent upon each of us to kind of not keep them unconscious, to like
Yeah.
make them conscious. I think that if
I'm
you're
not putting
asking
you
if
on the spot.
you, no, I'm just like, if you're asking like if you recognize someone else has an unconscious bias, how do you
Mm-hmm.
address that?
Yeah.
That one's tough. But there's a couple ways. I think one, if you can bring any evidence or data to the table, that's always helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Two, I think trying to engage them on it in the way we talked about earlier, where it's like coming from a place of like empathy and understanding, but like also wanting to point out something. I think that's also important because I think if you go in guns blazing, like people just shut down, right? Or they get
Defensive.
defensive. Yeah. So, um, there's also, I mean, there are people who are proponents of just like calling it out straight up. Like, would you have said this to me if I were a man? If if I were this, that, or the other thing? Like, and I think that's more direct, but it can be taken. I think it's easier to get defensive
Mm-hmm.
about something like that. So yeah, I don't know, and it depends too. Is it like a trend item? Like, is the like I hope it's a if you're going to address it that it's a trend item and it's not just a one off thing. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, you've consistently done this over time in multiple instances, like what's really going on.
Mm-hmm.
um so yeah, but if it's you can point it out all day, but unless somebody really acknowledges that they have a bias,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you can hope for the behavior to get fixed, to be addressed, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that they will keep doing it because it's still in that unconscious place, like they're not like accepting
Yeah.
that they
You
have
mentioned
it.
you mentioned a resource, and maybe this is a good way for like leadership or like supervisors to implement. Be like, hey, let's do this resource and kind of like let them know like, hey, you actually do have a bias, or just have an open communication, like a team meeting almost, and you're like, because it is self work. And unless someone's going to almost help you, you may not even realize that you need to do that self work, that self reflection.
Yeah, and there's so this is called the Harvard Implicit Association Test, and there, if you just Google that, you'll find the website for it. I do want to caveat that with there are some caveats or like things that you should be aware of
Mm-hmm.
with taking it. So, I mean, there's been a lot of research on that uses IATs, but I think it's a really good place to start. And I think researching why we have them, why does bias happen? Why do we stare at DNA? And
Mm-hmm.
it kept us safe for, you know, like thousands and thousands of years. Like this is how our brain works because it came from a survival place of um, other groups are a threat to my group. Like for me to survive, I have to stick with my group, and and those other people are scary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or they're dangerous or whatever. And so, biases are formed like in like early development. Like you learn these things early, and
Mm-hmm.
it's hard. Like, and you may never undo them. They may always be a part of your psychology, but it doesn't mean that you can't learn skills to overcome it, like at all. And I think the most important thing is to recognize that if you're going to call someone else out on a bias, like you better know what yours are, and you better know, you know what I mean? Like,
Right. That's a very good point. because it's like you can't
Yeah.
call someone else out if like you also have a bias that isn't being
Well,
addressed.
we all have them. Like, if we have
Right,
to be humble about that, like, this is just, it's not about a value judgment on that person. It's like we all struggle with
right.
this.
Yes.
So coming from a place of like humility and being humble about it, I think is like a really good way to start addressing anybody else's stuff, you know?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Like, it's so I always feel like it always starts with self reflection, and then you can't really implement anything until like you know yourself and like where you're coming from. So I think that
Yeah.
is a very good point of like make sure you know what your biases are if you're gonna call someone else out. And because you're right, like no matter how I don't know if good is the word, but like you're always gonna have a slight bias. Like no matter how much you work towards it, you're always gonna have a slight bias. Everyone's gonna have it. It's just you're right, like, having that humility and understanding and working on it to move forward.
Yeah. I had this I was going to tell you real quick. Like, I had a boss once that this didn't happen to me, but it happened to somebody I worked with, and they went in for their like review, their what, I am losing my words. Oh my goodness. Um,
The
their
performance review.
feedback,
Oh, yep. Okay.
like their feedback, right?
Yep.
And the this leader was told this person like, "Hey, I don't see you as a leader. I have a stereotype of what a leader is, and I know that about myself. And um, like you don't look or behave like that way," and that comes off really bad. But the next thing he said was, "I need you to check me on my stereotyping and my bias because um, I know this about myself. I know that I
Mm-hmm.
think that a leader looks like this, sounds like this, does these things. Um, but I also know that leadership skills have nothing to do with the way that somebody looks. So,
Mm-hmm.
if you sense that I am treating you in accordance with what I already know my bias is, I expect you to call me out on it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
so that's another way that you can go after it too, is to just like be vulnerable and put it out there. I don't know if it works for everybody, but it worked for this person. Like, yeah. So,
I mean,
all
like
right,
I said,
sorry.
no, I mean, I think that's great because like you have to know yourself, right? And transparency, vulnerability sometimes do make like better leaders and foster open communication and trust. Um, so yeah, like if you're open to it, like I know a couple people like doing this podcast, like they want to share their stories just to help other people and change their perspectives on certain things that they encountered, and just being vulnerable can really change a lot of mindsets and perspectives. So kind of just to wrap up, like what would you say are like some end notes or spark notes for someone to take away from this podcast?
Okay. So one one thing I would say is that DEI is can be thought of in a lot of different ways, right? Um, there are things that are exist outside of your control. Sometimes, like policies and trainings and programs, and then there's things within your control, which is your attitude. It's the way that you behave. It's the effort that you put in. And the way that you interact with people. Um, because at the end of the day, the overall like DEI culture and climate consists of all of these little individual actions and interactions among people that aggregate to like a whole, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we all have a part to play. Secondly, I would say that it's important to recognize that not everybody feels the same way about DEI. So it's a and that's okay. Um, but I think what's healthy is to have respectful, open dialogue about a lot of this stuff. And at the end of the day, I think we have to keep in mind just what is the goal, and that is like to what do we want out of DEI, or like really out of any of these things? It's to be treated fairly. It's to feel cared about. It's to have trust and respect in our organization with the people that we work with. And we can call it DEI, but we don't have to. We can call it anything. Like
Mm-hmm.
a lot of this stuff people are doing anyway. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one thing that I'm really, I've really like come to realize or learn, is that like don't get caught up on the language of DEI. Like do if you're doing those things, you're doing it. Like you're doing DEI. Like you
Mm-hmm.
don't, you know, I don't know. Like I've had conversations with squadron commanders to flight commanders to, you know, airmen. And there's kind of this sense of dread about DEI. Like, I don't know what it is. I'm afraid I'm going to mess it up. I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
get in trouble. Like all these things, like it kind of boils down to just like acknowledging that people are different. Um, and then, you know, acknowledging that some people are going to, and it doesn't matter why, but some people are going to require um, a different way of being interacted with or being led, or they might need something different than someone else to be successful in the organization. Yeah, and just like, I don't know, just to try, just try, you know, as long as you're not doing something, know what's legal, know what's illegal. Okay.
Yeah.
Just like if you know, like, you know, what's legal and what's illegal, you know, just do your best, and like you're going to be doing it,
Mm-hmm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah. No,
It doesn't
I,
matter what we call it, like all that stuff. You know, we went over all these kind of definitions and things, but you know, it's being good people, it's caring about people, it is leadership, it's peer
yeah.
leadership, it's all these things. So hopefully that covers it. That's kind of, I think, my Cliff Notes version.
Yeah. Honestly, I couldn't have said it better. Like, that's everything I probably would have said, except you're the expert. I'm just listening. I think this has been like so great. Like, I've learned honestly so
Thank
much.
you.
Mine was always very base knowledge. So having this conversation with you has like definitely opened up my mind and opened up like my horizons on it. So thank you for sharing all your expertise. With that being said, if someone wanted to connect with you, how can they find you?
They can, so I'm on LinkedIn. And I can send you my links or whatever. I'm like that's like my professional
Mm-hmm.
area. Like I do have like Instagram and stuff, but I think just by LinkedIn and email are probably the best. And I'm at tholmes3 at UMD for a while longer. I don't know when they shut my email off. Or I'm tara.holmes at us.af.mil in global. I think those are probably the best ways. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Tara, thank you so much for doing this. Like I said, it
Yeah.
was
Thank you.
very, this has been an amazing conversation, and I hope people take away like what I took away from this conversation. Um, Other than that, thanks again. And if you guys have any questions, please reach out to her. Or if you want her to have another podcast episode, I'm sure she would gladly talk about more DEI with her dissertation. Like I said, she's very involved with this, and I'm so happy she was able to join us.
Well, thank you. And thanks so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure. And I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, everyone, if you have any questions, reach out to one of us. Until next time, talk to you soon.